Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the fourth session of Arthur Gottlieb's James Monroe on Historical Perspective. I would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsor for this program, the Monroe Historical Society. Now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Arthur Gottlieb.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. I have a ton of information here. It's a matter with these things, of course, of just how to I guess, edit it into some kind of a format that makes sense during the period of time that we have. And when I was asked to do this program on James Monroe, I jumped at it because there's not a lot of information about this particular period of history, specifically American history, and has it affects the transition point really from the first chapter of our history, which was American independence, up to the War of 1812, which might even be considered the Second War of Independence by some. And really, the United States in the early 1800s being able to express itself as a new nation and whatever that entailed. And we're going to get into that and have been getting into it. And as I said to you last time, it was before something that took all of the air out of the room, the American Civil War. You see, so the United States is now in a position during Monroe's tenure as president, feeling its own oats a little bit, and ironing out some massive differences that it has as far as ideology, or what we would call just today party politics. And the world sees the United States now for the first time during the Monroe administration as an entity. Right, not a powerful entity. I mean, we are considered, these snotty newcomers. As a matter of fact, history shows us that people had considered us snotty newcomers, even up to recent history. If you want to think about Americans going over to Europe in World War I or World War II, it was literally the new world coming back to the old world, and the old world in the form of European monarchies and other nations saw themselves as, ancient civilizations, matured compared to the new, out of control United States of America. I think I use certain analogies that make sense to me. I hope they make sense to you. I use them from my experience as a counselor. I do a lot of intergenerational counseling, and all of us have had the opportunity to be young at some point. And I know from myself, when I was old enough to have a little bit of independence, but young enough not to have much maturity, you're in a position where you're, for me at least, I'll speak of my own self, maybe even a little dangerous, when you think, oh, you're a little cocky, you're not under the pressure of people telling you what to do because they consider you a child, and you want to have your own sense of independence, and you're going to show people that you're independent, right? And meanwhile, now that I'm older, I know what that looks like from an older person looking at a younger person, right? But when I was a younger person, I only saw it from my perspective, of course. So what I'm getting at is I want you to think about the United States in those terms. I mean, barely 50 years old. The United States is literally like a college kid, and it's got its own car, and it's, hopefully something terrible isn't going to happen, or some bad judgments aren't going to be made with the newfound independence that one has. And the rest of the world, those traditional European countries, the older countries, are in a state of perpetual decline in response to the United States getting stronger, and the older countries are going to eventually get weaker, right? It's kind of like looking, to use my analogy again, the younger person is going to be on the ascendancy, and the older people in one's lives are eventually going to reach their peak and be in some level of descendancy, you see. And that's the way the United States was. We were on a state of ascendancy despite ourselves, and the other nations were in a state of descendancy despite themselves. And the kind of resentment that came from these other nations that took, 1,000 years to develop their cultures and their heritage and their documents and their art forms and their literature, et cetera. And now here you have the United States, as I mentioned, barely 50 years old, and essentially nobody's telling us what to do. We've got this. And not only that, but we're probably better than you anyway. And why don't you just stay in your side of the line and we'll stay on our side of the line. Thank you very much. You see, so there was this level of contrast between the old world and the new world. And we represented the new world, of course, and it really was a new world. That is something we don't really think about much today. You and I are, probably over a certain age, and collectively. So I remember, and probably so do you, when, unless it was on television or unless you read it, that's all it was. And everything had sort of a local character to it. And I want you to just to remind you about people that are younger than, I don't know, probably 40 years old. They've lived in a more international kind of a context, right? Which changes the way we perceive history, certainly as it applies to what we're talking about right now. You see, I don't know, when I was a kid, what did we have? We had, so our TV antenna on top of our apartment building, it was like this forest of antennas. They were all pointed towards, the Empire State Building, right? Because that's where stuff was broadcast from, right? And I'd be up there with my father, and and we knew where the Empire State Building was because you could see the Throgs Neck Bridge from my house. So we sort of pointed it that way. So you had Channel 2, Channel 4, Channel 5. Well, don't tell me I know these things. Channel 7, Channel 9, and Channel 11, right? WPIX, and Channel 13, right? And because you had, my mother watched Channel 13 because my mother had culture, right? So it was local. I mean, everything had this New York kind of shtick to it. Everything, it was local. And you heard about things from other parts of the country, and it was the other part of the country. You heard about something from Europe, and it was Europe, and I heard stories from my father when he was in the Navy in, between World War II and he didn't serve in Korea, but he was reactivated for the Korean War, right? They sent him, where they sent him? Morocco. How's that? And so he was like, he had these stories of these faraway places, that truly it was like traveling to another planet, looking at the photographs and hearing him talking. So my point to you, not to belabor this, is that if you're under 40 years old and you've spent your entire life on the internet, those kind of boundaries don't exist the way they existed for somebody my age. I mean, something going on in the European Union or something going on, in the subcontinent of India or anywhere in the Far East, anywhere, it's as good as it's on our screen right now, right at this moment, you see. In the days of Monroe, you were living in the shadow of the founding fathers, right? And I told you about the direct influence, of course, of one of the most seminal of all of the founding fathers, which was Thomas Jefferson and his democratic republicanism, right? But Washington had a big influence on this, George Washington. And everybody was still carrying the notion of what George Washington, the father of our country, if you will, had regarding what the United States was. And we understand what we were in this regard because you're comparing it to other things, right? I mean, cognitively, right? I learned this from cognitive psychology, and it's true. We compare ourselves to other things, right? I'm me because I'm not you. I'm here because I'm not there, right? I'm not 20 years old anymore because, well, I ain't 20 years old anymore. Okay. And, so everything is a constant comparison, right? I'm going to take the Merritt Parkway. I'm going to take 95. And George Washington identified what we should be in his founding remark, in his farewell remarks, right? Which would make another great presentation, I think, in some other time. And he was saying that the United States was truly the new world, and we should aspire to be the best that Western civilization had to offer, free from the encumbrance of Europe. You see, George Washington gave us that initial vision of we're over here and you're over there, and there's a reason why we're over here, and we would prefer it if you stayed over there. You see? Now, maybe I've oversimplified that, but sometimes that sort of a thing is good to make a point. I mean, George Washington, that was his thing. He did not want us to get involved. He warned us about getting involved in foreign entanglements, right? And he was referring specifically to Europe. Like, Washington knew that there was always going to be war in Europe. Always. There always was. There always will be. And the people who had come to what was to become the United States in the form of colonies, or even before that, the original settlers or anything, were, generally speaking, were looking to get the hell out of there from Europe. I mean, specifically England and other places. And that continued on through a kind of a melting pot sort of a legacy now, terms that we don't even use anymore, right? To people like my grandparents, right? Who around the turn of the last century were, well, frankly, peasants. It's not a term we apply to Americans, really. But in Europe, that would have been absolutely correct. I mean, it was, and people are constantly asking me, oh, were you related to Dr. Gottlieb? And he's got this whole private practice, or this guy over here is Senator Gottlieb, or whoever it is, right? I just made that up. I don't know if there's a Senator Gottlieb, and I'm like, no, we're from the other Gottliebs, right? And when it's nobody had anything, but they came over here because they were living in abject poverty and had no opportunity, and to a certain extent, from a Jewish faith, a level of oppression, I would add, on top of it. Certainly in the case of my Ukrainian grandfather, okay, who left Ukraine as a fugitive. All right. Excuse me. So, but like I said to you today, in our context, in the year 2023, we live in a more global order, right? The kind of definitions of we're over here and you're over there literally don't even exist conceptually anymore as they do for people who are older. That's how fast things have changed. And I'm taking the time to explain this because it's critical, because we're looking at something, we're using a tool of analysis to talk about history. We must understand the current way that history is looked at. And this really applies here. So, like, I'm constantly in a situation where, the founding fathers, or whatever term you want to apply to that group of people, is, practically considered irrelevant, or even something that needs to be moved past, as far as something that is considered to be put on a pedestal and admired, right? And these are part of the reasons why I'm explaining this. The era of Monroe was literally 1 foot on the dock and 1 foot on the boat, as far as the founding fathers were concerned, into what was going to be a period of early modernity, right? And we had two major things that were going to happen here during Monroe's term, right? We were going to have the next generation of people, as represented by the person I'm going to talk most about today, John Quincy Adams. And you may note, by the way, that I use the New England pronunciation of John Quincy Adams, right? Quincy as in Z, Quincy. And John Quincy Adams was really, he was a new generation. And the new generation, close enough to his father's generation, the founding generation, right? And nobody could have been closer than that than John Quincy Adams, right? With his mother being Abigail Adams and his father being John Adams. I mean, that's like sitting there listening to my father talk about when they, when he was in Italy. I mean, it's like you're listening to your father speak. It's a very, very direct thing, you see, and nobody had more experience than John Quincy Adams. Now, meanwhile, he spent most of his time in the background throughout his career, mostly because he wasn't there to make a lot of noise. Second of all, because people couldn't stand him. He was a real pain in the ass, like his father. He had like zero capacity to get along with other people, like his father. And so, he rebuffed a lot of people, but you couldn't help but the fact that the guy was like pretty darn smart, you see. And it was just something he inherited from his old man, I guess, right? I mean, if he was here right now, I'd probably skip this presentation and talk to him, but he ain't. So we'll have to speculate where we need to. So John Quincy Adams now was looking from a different vantage point of his father's generation. His father's generation was, how do we even become a nation? And what is our identity going to be based on the other historical examples that we have, which were plentiful, by the way, by that time, by the time our Constitution was written, et cetera, as far as forms of government. I mean, the biggest comparison that we were going to make, that we wanted to make sure we weren't, was Great Britain, because Great Britain it was something that we complained about the monarchy. I mean, just read the Declaration of Independence, and we had a list of grievances specifically against King George. So we didn't want to have any of the excesses or the kind of authoritarian power that was inherent in a centralized figure in the government. But on the other hand, all of our basic laws are based in English law, you see. That was the contrast. The revolution was about, it's not that we hated Great Britain. See, the problem was that we loved Great Britain, and people in America loved being English, you see. The problem is that the English, where it came to us, the English seemed to have thrown out their own laws as it pertained to the common person when it came to us here in the colonies. And we were angry because of their hypocrisy, that they weren't carrying out English law as we should have been treated with all fairness. You see, that is where the rub lie, right? People say to me, oh, well, I ask people all the time in these things, well, why did the United States break away from Great Britain? And they say to me, well, because we didn't want to pay our taxes, which kind of makes us look, I don't know, what would be a word? Petty? Would that be a good word? And that wasn't it. The problem was, it wasn't the It wasn't the injury, it was the insult that we were being asked to be force-fed this nonsense from Parliament that they were treating us okay, when in fact we were getting screwed pretty badly, you see. So maybe that in our American character, if there is one, something emerged at that point, which equated to essentially, I don't know, two middle fingers back at you, you see. And right at that moment may have been the beginning of our national character. All right, because I believe in a large way that still exists in people's hearts, not necessarily Great Britain, and regrettably towards ourselves, but Adams now, we had consolidated as a country, and Adams was the Secretary of State appointed by Monroe. And like I said to you, there were two people that I was going to focus on, particularly in this program, the whole program, which was going to be Jackson, right, which we hit last time, and Adams, because they literally defined his presidency, Monroe's presidency. And like, for instance, I'm going to talk a lot about the Monroe Doctrine today. And the Monroe Doctrine was written by John Quincy Adams. And the whole thing was negotiated by John Quincy Adams. You know, so historians look at this and say, well, why it should really be called the Adams Doctrine. Why isn't it called the Adams Doctrine? Well, Adams wanted to keep it just as like this international thing between him and the other diplomats and all the rest of that, and that would have been fine for him. But Monroe, he decided that he wanted to turn this into a major identity point for the United States of America, and he turned around and made the whole thing public. You see, that was Monroe who did that, and that is why it's called the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe didn't have anything to do with it, and he approved it. It was John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams had so much experience. I mean, even before this, I mean, he was the liaisons to several countries. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. He was talking to the Spanish. He was talking to the French. He was talking to the British, right? He had to talk to the Russians, and on and on and on and on and on. And this guy was able to do it. And I think I mentioned to you last time as an interesting point of homework to watch the movie Amistad, right? I don't remember when they came out. Okay, but it actually, John Quincy Adams is a central figure in the court case that had to do with the Amistad. I don't want to kill the movie for you. Okay, it's sort of like a historical drama, you know, so I don't want to wreck it for you, but I would recommend it. And Adams is played by, who was his name, Anthony Hopkins, you know, so I like anything that he does anyway, but that's besides the point. It really is, it's the end of Adams's life, and he has a chance to do something really important, and he just, in his, you know, reluctant, gruff way, you know, he doesn't want to do it, just leave me alone, and he goes and he steps forward for something that is really, really important. Okay, so I'll just leave that as a teaser for you. So when we say, what is the Monroe Doctrine? This is like one of the most lasting legacies of this era, okay? And like I said, Monroe himself was only incidental to it, right? So, but it bears his name. And then later on, when we talk later on, like maybe next week, when we talk about legacy and contemporary considerations, right? Right, so we'll talk about how the Monroe Doctrine actually defined our foreign policy and our kind of continental policy, you know? And then it was something called the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, or it called the Roosevelt corollary, which had to do with Teddy Roosevelt, right? Who actually used the Monroe Doctrine to build upon for what, you know, many modern historians would consider what we would say was American imperialism in the Americas. All right, so that's also very, very important. And this is where it all starts over here. So this is a period of time during Monroe's tenure as president. The United States we've moved past the eastern colonies, the eastern states. Right now, we've passed the Appalachia into the Ohio Valley. Right, we have the Louisiana Purchase, which is only just moderately settled, you see. And there are still disputes in our continent from Spain. And, the French are still around. The British are still around. And we're facing the Russians up in the Pacific Northwest, you see. And so the point here is that it's still the North America, and frankly, all of the Americas are still seen by the old world colonial powers as being up for grabs. And to just get right to the end box in the flow chart, the Monroe Doctrine said, no, that's over. The United States has reached a point of, I guess what would be the word, sovereignty, right? We didn't have the power, right? This was more bravado. But we essentially said, you know what, the age of exploration is over in the Western Hemisphere. There's no other way I can put it, but that's pretty ballsy stuff, that's pretty ballsy stuff. And we're talking about France. We're talking about Spain, England, and politics that are going on in the world right at this moment, right, is circumstantial and situational for the things that we're going to be talking about today. But for me, it's another indication that nothing's changed. The kind of interests that countries have for themselves and their strategic interests and their alliances and their attitudes and the avarice and the greed and pride and the power and everything. You can change the names, you can change the faces. Nothing's changed. It is exactly the same. The technology has changed. The circumstances have changed as far as, geographic boundaries, etc. But people have not changed. For me, maybe, when you get me, you get somebody who looks at sociology, who looks at human nature, maybe more than somebody else who will be talking about the same subject, but I can't help it. So the issue with the Spanish, right, had to do with the fact that most of Latin America, places in the Caribbean, Florida, right, and elsewhere, Spain was hanging on by its fingernails as far as being in control of so many different places. Right? Take a look at South America, for instance, or Central America for that matter, and see how many places speak Spanish. Right? One doesn't need to be a rocket scientist for this, except for Brazil, where they speak, what is it, Portuguese, right? And it's a direct reflection of the age of exploration, the original age of exploration, right? And so with the United States now, by Monroe's time, we want to literally start recognizing countries in our own hemisphere as being free and independent states, because it's in our interest to do so, because we want countries to have solidarity with us, right? And meanwhile, that's a direct insult to Spain, because now we're putting ourselves in a position where we're trying to usurp their power, you see? And so, but we don't want to get too mad at Spain, because we want to kiss their butt enough so we wind up with Florida, for instance. You see what I mean? And we use circumstance to be able to grab Florida. And that's one of the things that Quincy does, right? John Quincy Adams. And so remember I was telling you last time about Andrew Jackson, right? And the Negro Fort and all the rest of that. You see, so when Jackson essentially invades another country and goes over Spain, ignoring like essentially an international boundary, right, into Spain to fight with the Seminoles and to chase people around over there, you know, and drive them back, way back. We say that it's in self-defense, right? And anyway, but anyway, Jackson's actions created a lot of problems in Washington, D.C., right? And John Quincy Adams's staff, when he was Secretary of State under Monroe, was saying like, we got to censure this guy. We've got to get rid of him. Somebody needs to court-martial him. You know, we can't have this guy. He was a loose cannon, Jackson, you see? But Adams singularly chose not to censor Jackson, right? So it becomes the official policy of the United States because we're not coming down on our guy who broke this international boundary and chased people around, and Spaniards around too, by the way. I mean, you know, Jackson had no compulsions. He went in there and he imprisoned the person, like the governor of Florida, the Spanish guy. We put our own person in place. We killed 2 other people that were officials, that were British officials. And I mean, it was, you know, it was in a different moment that would have been a declaration of war from England and Spain, you see, but Jackson got away with it. He angered everybody. It was outrageous, you see. And Adams, he used this as a political moment, right? Which is another thing that's never changed. It's never changed. I mean, right up to the present molecule of time, every single thing that happens today, right? You've got a room full of people sitting there saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we can use this, you see? And it was exactly the same right here, you see, because we want Florida. And so Adams negotiates with the Spanish, and everyone's calling for Jackson's head, right? They want to see Jackson in prison or hanged or something, right? It's an international outrage, you see? And here you have the United States of America. In the United States of America, with all of its lofty talk that all men are created equal, and we're outraged at the wrong behavior against another country by Great Britain, or actually we weren't another country at that time, we were still Englishmen. And then you see, so now if we don't censure Jackson, then we're nothing but a bunch of hypocrites, you see? The new country that says they're so great and better than everybody else is really just like everybody else, right? They've got their own crazy people doing their own crazy stuff, killing their own other people. And what's the difference? And so therefore, the United States is an empty suit, so to speak. So Quincy, he doesn't care, right? But it starts something. This is the first time the rest of the world is looking at the United States and saying, you know, you people think you're on the moral higher plane than everybody else, and you're not. You're the same as everybody else, right? Now, I do current events programs not every single day, but 3 times a week. And I'm doing one tonight. I'm doing one tomorrow morning, right? And I mean, it's in international affairs. Are we the good guys? Are we not the good guys? Are we intervening in places we shouldn't be intervening? Are we trying to flip other governments, right? Are we standing here on our moral high horse, and meanwhile, we're just really the same as everybody else? You see, these things have not changed, but what's interesting here is this the first time it happened, as far as us versus the world, right? Especially, you know, this would be like, I used the example when we first started, of the adolescent now who's got his own car and he's going to college, and you've been talking trash about your parents for years, right? And now it turns out that you're really like you're making the same kind of judgments, right? You're really no better than your parents after all, you see. And that was this moment, sort of like, as far as the world was concerned, of our comeuppance. But we were just going to use it. Like I said to you, we didn't care because we were on the ascendancy and everybody else is on the descendancy, right? All of those old world powers in this hemisphere, they were like your parents getting older. And then like you were just going to continue to get stronger. That's what this was like. You see? So Adams uses the Jackson thing down in Florida, right? And he goes to negotiate with the Spanish, and they're expecting Quincy Adams to, say, well, we've thrown Jackson in the dungeon. Of course, we didn't. We didn't say anything about it at all. As a matter of fact, we turned around and said that, you know what, the actions that Jackson took were right and proper because, after all, we had to defend ourselves because you, the Spanish in Florida, can't protect your own damn territory, which is your fault, and that's plausible. We, the Americans, we have to go in there and mop it up for you, you see? And if you don't get control over this area, we're going to have to go back again. And maybe this time we won't give you the land back. You see? I mean, it's real strong arm stuff. And what happened is that Spain became, we literally intimidated them. Adams intimidated them. And we eventually wound up with the whole eastern side of Florida because we basically told them that you are so weak, you can't control this area and somebody's got to control it. And it's right in our backyard. So we're going to wind up in here anyway. You see? Now, later on in other years, I mean, the United States in its own upper hand, right? We complained about other people doing this. I mean, the kind of justification we used here, right? It's not a perfect analogy, but it can be perceived as, it's kind of like Vladimir Putin saying, well, somebody's got to control the Crimea, so we're going in, right? And the Ukrainians can't handle it. See, so in current terms, I'm not making a moral equivalency of this. I'm saying that what the world is looking at as far as the way the map is moving around and justifications, et cetera, and then the response of another group of people who see themselves as having a higher moral hand, you see, it's not different than a lot of the things that are going on today, right? Whereas Russia is right next to the Ukraine, and the United States is like obviously right next to Florida at that point. You see what I mean? So that is the kind of way this was perceived back in those days by the other countries. And of course, we had like this love-hate relationship with the French, depending on what party you were in this country. I mean, after all, for Adams, he didn't want to trash the French because, I mean, after all, if it wasn't for the French, we wouldn't even be the United States of America, you see? But then on the other hand, the only reason that the French actually intervened in the War of Revolution to help the fledgling United States of America was pretty much to screw the British, you see? It's fascinating stuff, isn't it? Now, as far as the Monroe Doctrine is concerned, so John Quincy Adams is in a position now where he's able to secure a large part of Spanish Florida, right? And part of that negotiation is this tacit understanding that what is going to be Spanish-held territory, right, in the form of Mexico, right, is going to be that the United States wants a pathway out west, You see, so in these negotiations between the Spanish and John Quincy Adams, there's this implicit understanding that the United States is eventually going to reach the Pacific coast. You see, now of course this was going to become at the expense of Mexico, and Mexico itself had not long been free from Spain itself. You see, that leads the way eventually to what we're going to call the Mexican-American War, right? Which is, outside the scope of this program directly, but it's a direct result of the things that we're talking about as far as how we felt justified, etc. I just did a program the other day on Ulysses S. Grant, right? Now, Grant and Lee, for that matter, both served in the Mexican-American War. And Grant himself, it had a tremendous effect on him because he felt as though, the United States essentially fought that war with Mexico, not because it was necessary for any particular reason, that it was essentially just like this gigantic land grab, that we now had become the oppressor. And now that we had, in terms that we would use today, imperialistic, and that we did it because we could do it, you see, based on some little premise, right? And that's the way Grant felt about the Mexican-American War, which of course, like, basically filled out the rest of the country. You had, of course, the original states, and then you had, the Ohio Valley settlements, right? And then you had the Louisiana Purchase, which was this phenomenal chunk of land, of course. And then finally, the Mexican-American War yielded, the rest of Texas and all the way to California, all the way up to like the Oregon Territory. This is a fantastic piece of land. And this was all rationalized and justified based on an interpretation of what happened here with the Monroe Doctrine, you see. Another term that was used alongside of all of this was manifest destiny, which is more like this philosophical thing saying, like, because of who we are and because we're on God's mission, so to speak, it's, it's better off in our hands than it is in your hands, okay? Which is technically a rationalization, if you see what I mean. So the Monroe Doctrine is by Adams. One of the things that he's best well known for. All right. Now, I'm going to read something to you here. There's no way that I can encapsulate this better than what it is. And I wanted to pick something that was going to be from Monroe's own words, right? Because we don't hear a lot about you. Do you remember hearing anything about something that James Monroe actually said, like some big speech or anything? Well, so I wanted to pick something because I thought that would be good for a program like this. Now, let's see what Monroe has to say in his own words. And this was his 7th State of the Union address, right? Which would have been, 1824. And this is where James Monroe announces, not only to the Americas, but to the world, that there's essentially like a new sheriff in town, right? And I was going to summarize this, but like I said to you, I wanted to do something, at least in this program, that was going to give us a sense of the flavor of Monroe's, his cadence, the way he worded things, his own thoughts, his own rationalizations. Remember, he wasn't considered like a big genius. He wasn't Thomas Jefferson, or he wasn't some, big pillar of philosophy or something like that. And I thought it would be good, not to make myself redundant, but I wanted to do something, even if it meant I had to read it, that was going to be something that was his. And this is what I've chose to do. So this is at the State of the Union. in 1824. All right, so let's pretend that you and I are in Congress and we're listening to the president, and this is his address, which of course was going to become international news, right? I mean, it wasn't like it was on C-SPAN or something, right? And he speaks in this sort of like this old English sort of a little bit clunky way. It doesn't quite flow like something that would be written today would hopefully flow. And then on the other hand, I mean, some people are just better speakers than others. And some, I guess you have to rely on, I don't know what they did for speechwriters back in those days. And I doubt if he was standing up there with a teleprompter either. So you ready? So you forgive me for looking over while I read this. Right, now this has to do with Monroe's speech regarding the position of the United States and the world at this particular juncture. Remember, this is, we have, it's practically a bluff. We're telling the world that we now are going to do something. We really didn't have the political or the military clout to do any of this. I mean, it's not like it's a treaty. It's not like it's ratified. It was a doctrine, you see? It was a doctrine, but this thing has had a tremendous effect on world events and our own perception of ourselves and the perception of other countries towards us. That's why I'm taking the time on this. This is literally a seminal thing that occurred during Monroe's tenure. Just going to write myself down a note of something else I want to talk to you about after this. And that is Henry Clay and the Missouri Compromise. See, literally a sticky note. All right, here we go. Fellow citizens of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Many important subjects will claim your attention during the present session, of which I shall endeavor to give, in aid of your deliberations, a just idea in this communication. I undertake this duty with diffidence from the vast extent of the interests on which I have to treat and of their great importance to every portion of our union. I enter on it with zeal from a thorough conviction that there never was a period since the establishment of our revolution when, regarding the condition of the civilized world and its bearing on us, there was a greater necessity for devotion in the public servants to their respective duties, or for virtue, patriotism, and union in our constituents. Meeting in you a new Congress, I deem it proper to present this view of public affairs in greater detail than might otherwise be necessary. I do it, however, with peculiar satisfaction from a knowledge that in this respect, I shall comply more fully with the sound principles of our government. The people being with us exclusively the sovereign, it is indispensable that full information be laid before them on all important subjects to enable them to exercise that high power with complete effect. If kept in the dark, they must be incompetent to it. We are liable to error, and those who are engaged in the management of public affairs are more subject to excitement and to be led astray by their particular interests and passions than the great body of our constituents who, living at home in the pursuit of their ordinary avocations, are calm but deeply interested spectators of events and of the conduct of those who were parties to them. To the people every department of the government and every individual in each are responsible. And the more full their information, the better they can judge of the wisdom of the policy pursued and of the conduct of each in regard to it. From their dispassionate judgment, much aid may always be obtained, while their approbation will form the greatest incentive and most gratifying reward for virtuous actions, and the dread of their censure the best security against the abuse of their confidence. Their interests in all vital questions are the same, and the bond by sentiment as well as by interests will be proportionately strengthened as they are better informed of the real state of public affairs, especially in difficult conjunctures. It is by such knowledge that local prejudices and jealousies are surmounted, and that a national policy extending its fostering care and protection to all of the great interests of our union is formed and steadily adhered to. A precise knowledge of our relations with foreign powers as respects our negotiations and transactions with each is thought to be particularly necessary. Equally necessary is it that we should, for a just estimate of our resources, revenue, and progress in every kind of improvement connected with the national prosperity and public defense. It is by rendering justice to other nations that we may expect it from them. It is by our ability to resent injuries and redress wrongs that we may avoid them. The commissioners under the 5th article of the Treaty of Ghent, remember that was the treaty that negotiated by Adams, ending the War of 1812. The commissioners under the 5th article of the Treaty of Ghent, having disagreed in their opinions respecting that portion of the boundary between the territories of the United States and of Great Britain, the establishment of which had been submitted to them, have made their respective reports in compliance with that article, that the same might be referred to the decision of a friendly power. It being manifest, however, that it would be difficult, if not impossible, for any power to perform that office without great delay and much inconvenience to itself, a proposal has been made by this government and acceded to by that of Great Britain to endeavor to establish that boundary by amicable negotiation. In appearing from long experience that no satisfactory arrangement could be formed of the commercial intercourse between the United States and the British colonies in this hemisphere by legislative acts, while each party pursued its own course without agreement or concert with the other, a proposal has been made to the British government to regulate this commerce by treaty, as it has been to arrange in like manner the just claims of the citizens of the United States inhabiting the states and the territories bordering on the lakes, he's talking about the Great Lakes, and rivers which empty into the St. Lawrence, to the navigation of that river to the ocean. For these and other objects of high importance to the interests of both parties, a negotiation has been opened with the British government, which it is hoped will have a satisfactory result. At this point, just to take a sidestep, in the Treaty of Ghent, and then afterwards, it was the first time that we had this kind of a demilitarization agreement with another nation, the first time in history. And what happened was that we demilitarized the Great Lakes and the areas around Lake Champlain, et cetera. Because remember, there was a lot of fighting up there when we were trying to go into Canada. So essentially what happened here is that the United States and Great Britain agreed to demilitarize. and just say it's going to be open, it's going to be free. It was the first time in history that there was ever a treaty between two nations agreeing to completely demilitarize an area and essentially just have us, we trust you and you trust us. It was interesting stuff for the time. The commissioners under the 6th and 7th articles of the Treaty of Ghent, having successfully closed their labors in relation to the 6th, have proceeded to the discharge of these relating to the 7th. Their progress in the extensive survey required for the performance of their duties justifies the presumption that it will be completed in the ensuing year. The negotiation, which has been long pending with the French government on several important subjects, and particularly for a just indemnity for losses sustained in the late wars by the citizens of the United States under justifiable seizures and confiscations of their property, has not yet had the desired effect. As this claim rests on the same principle with others, which have been admitted by the French government, it is not perceived on what just ground it can be rejected. A minister will immediately be appointed to proceed to France and resume the negotiations on this and other subjects which may arise between the two nations. At the proposal of the Russian imperial government, made through the minister of the emperor residing here, a full power and instructions have been transmitted to the minister of the United States at St. Petersburg to arrange by amicable negotiation the respective rights and interests of the two nations on the northwest coast of this continent, right? That was what I was talking about before around where Oregon is, right, and Washington. A similar proposal has been made by His Imperial Majesty to the government of Great Britain, which has likewise been acceded to. The government of the United States has been desirous by this friendly proceeding of manifesting the great value which they have invariably attached to the friendship of the emperor and their solicitude to cultivate the best understanding with his government. In the discussions to which this interest has given rise, and in the arrangements by which they may terminate the occasion, has been judged proper for asserting, is as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, right? Notice the American continents in plural, right? North and south, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Okay, now that one statement rattled the chandeliers all through Europe. Okay, who are we to make such a claim? We basically said, you know, we're here, we're doing it, we're taking care of it, and it's us now, not you. I don't know if you noticed also a subtle shift here in the previous two paragraphs. You know, beforehand, before the Treaty of Ghent, before the War of 1812 was over, I mean, Britain was, like I said, it was, you can consider it the Second War of Revolution, you know, the Second War of Independence, frankly. You know, so, but now we are like in alignment with Great Britain. You see, economically and politically, we have become more aligned with Great Britain, and we've taken a little bit of a patina to the shiny relationship we had with France. And it has to be very understood. You can't be like pals with everybody, you see, because if you're lining up with Great Britain, it means that you're essentially pushing France away. If you're lining up with France, it means you're pushing Great Britain away. So politically here, as a result of the War of 1812, we have aligned ourselves more now with Great Britain. And this also has to do with what's going on in this country. And we've got the rise of, not the rise of the South, but you have, you know, new mechanisms for the manufacture of cotton and the distribution of textiles out of this quickly industrializing nation, our nation, and we're sending those goods and those services out to, Great Britain was our, probably our biggest exporter. I mean, export destination, you see. So you see how, political alliances line up with the economic interests at any given time also. And that's certainly something that hasn't changed either, right? Since the close of the last section of Congress, the commissioners and arbitrators for ascertaining and determining the amount of indemnification which may be due to citizens of the United States under the decision of His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor of Russia, in conformity to the convention concluded at St. Petersburg. That's was in 1822. Have assembled in this city and organized themselves as a board for the performance of the duties assigned to them by that treaty. The commission constituted under the 11th article of the treaty between the United States and Spain, right? That was going back to that thing I was telling you about that Quincy Adams did after the, after the Jackson thing. The commission constituted under the 11th article of the treaty of his 1819 treaty between the United States and Spain is also in session here. And as the term of 3 years limited by the treaty for the execution of the trust will expire before the period of the next regular meeting of Congress, the attention of the legislature will be drawn to the measures which may be necessary to accomplish the objects for which the commission was instituted. In compliance with the resolution of the House of Representatives adopted at their last session, instructions have been given to all the ministers of the United States accredited to the powers of Europe and America to propose the prescription of the African slave trade by classing it under the denomination and inflicting on its perpetrators the punishment of piracy. Did you get that? Should this proposal be acceded to, it is not doubted that this odious and criminal practice will be promptly and entirely suppressed. It is earnestly hoped that it will be acceded to from the firm belief that it is the most effectual expedient that can be adopted for the purpose. At the commencement of the recent war between France and Spain, right? So we're also looking at what's going on in Europe, you see. It's a smaller world than it was 50 years ago, even during the time of the revolution, right? Our foreign policy, the others' foreign policy have to do with what's happening here and what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the Caribbean, what's happening in South America, what's happening everywhere. The world has gotten smaller pretty quickly. The commencement of the recent war between France and Spain, it was declared by the French government that it would grant no commissions to privateers and that neither the commerce of Spain herself nor of neutral nations should be molested by the naval force of France, except in the breach of a lawful blockade. This declaration, which appears to have been faithfully carried into effect, concurring with principles proclaimed and cherished by the United States from the first establishment of their independence, suggested the hope that time had arrived when the proposal for adopting it as a permanent and invariable rule in all future maritime wars might meet the favorable consideration of the great European powers. Instructions have accordingly been given to our ministers with France, Russia, and Great Britain to make those proposals to their respective governments. And when the friends of humanity reflect on the essential amelioration to the condition of the human race, which would result from the abolition of a private war on the sea, and on the great facility by which it might be accomplished, requiring only the consent of a few sovereigns. An earnest hope is indulged that these overtures will meet with an attention animated by the spirit in which they were made, and that they will ultimately be successful. Now, I just want to point something out here. What the United States, what John Quincy Adams wants to make sure doesn't happen, right? And why this is in here and what's known now as the Monroe Doctrine. Let me use a better example to make the point that I'm going to make. Right? How did we wind up with Puerto Rico? How did we wind up with the Philippines? We, us, the United States. How did we wind up with Guam? Remember the Spanish-American War that happened later, right? What happened was we went to war with Spain, and then Spain lost, and we took their territories. You see? So now that France is at war with Spain, all this time earlier, 70 years earlier, we, John Quincy Adams, doesn't want to see France win a war with Spain in Europe and then wind up with Spanish colonies here, you see? So we're trying to prevent France from flipping sovereignty with Spain, the same way that we flipped sovereignty with Spain, you see, later on, 70 years later. So we won a war with Spain, we took their stuff, and then the Philippines became an American protectorate. Puerto Rico became an American protectorate. Hell, Cuba became an American protectorate. Guam became an American protectorate, you see? But what we're trying to do right here is prevent France from being able to do that, you see? I mean, it was okay for us to do it 70 years later because, well, it was us. See what I mean? It was us. So that's different because of manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine. Well, we should probably be in charge of this anyway, you see? That's another part of what I was trying to get at earlier, as far as our own rationalization of like, it's okay for us to do it. So the ministers who were appointed to the republics of Colombia and Buenos Aires during the last session of Congress proceeded shortly afterwards to their destinations. Of their arrival, their official intelligence has not yet been received. The minister appointed to the Republic of Chile will sail in a few days. An early appointment will also be made to Mexico. A minister has been received from Colombia, and the other governments have been informed that ministers or diplomatic agents of inferior grade would be received from each, according to as they might prefer the one or the other. The minister appointed to Spain proceeded soon after the appointment for Cadiz, the residence of the sovereign to whom he was accredited. In approaching that port, the frigate which conveyed him was warned off by the commander of the French squadron, by which it was blockaded and not permitted to enter, although appraised by the captain of the frigate of the public character of the person whom he had on board, the landing of whom was the sole object of this proposed entry. This act, being considered an infringement of the rights of ambassadors and nations, will form a just cause of complaint to the government of France against the officer by whom it was committed. The actual condition of the public finances more than realizes the favorable anticipations that were entertained of it at the opening of the last session of Congress. On the 1st of January, there was a balance of the Treasury. Okay. It goes on to talk about the budget and the bank, right? It talks about, it is a State of the Union address, so I don't want to like kill you with this, okay? I wanted to get the part that it really had to do with the Monroe Doctrine. So most of the rest of this has to do with, just the normal stuff that has to do with expenditures and budgets, and other things like that. We have made an announcement here that the United States of America now is going to consider itself the protectorate, the caretaker, the whole monitor of everything that goes on in the Western Hemisphere, right? If there's some fight between France and Spain, we don't want France coming in here and flipping all of these Spanish countries into French countries, right? It is a major announcement, this whole thing here. I wish that I could do a follow-up on this as this, well, maybe I'll do some of it next time, about the impact that this had on very, very near history, even in, the latter part of the 19th century. Certainly as it led up to situations having to do with Teddy Roosevelt, the United States becoming a world power, this sort of a thing. I wanted to leave room here. That's why I sort of like abbreviated what I was doing here. Because I still want to talk about something else that was very important in the second term here that occurred in Monroe's tenure. And that was the Missouri Compromise, you see. So we've got the international stuff. We've got moving across the nation, right, in the form that I was just describing in this Monroe Doctrine Manifest Destiny, and essentially, kind of like announcing that we had more authority over here. We, the United States, had more sovereign authority on this landmass than any European nation now, you see. So it's not an open game anymore like it was only 50 years ago, right? That paves the way for more of an expansion into these territories. Now, we had the Louisiana Purchase already, which has already happened, right? Which is this vast, it doubled the size of the United States, like in one shot, right? If you want to figure out how much we paid for the land, it comes out to like 3.5 cents an acre, right? It's just absolutely incredible acquisition. And the first state that's there, actually, that is applying from a territory into statehood is the state of Missouri, right? So that you had to start off with a territory, and then you had to organize it, and then you had to apply essentially to Washington, D.C. for admission to the Union. And that's the way it worked. So the issue then becomes domestically for us, well, is it going to be admitted to the Union as a slave state or a free state? See? And this is essentially right there. This is one of the seminal markers of something that just ain't going to work. It's just not going to work. And this was a period of time. Henry Clay, who made this compromise, right, it was essentially a Pollyanna is the wrong word. It's kind of like everybody gets a lollipop, It's like we're going to pretend that we don't have this major problem here. And that major problem being, as eloquently put better than anybody else by Abraham Lincoln, house divided against itself, it cannot stand. I mean, as we were adding states to the Union, the Southern congressmen who obviously were looking out for the interests of their people and their culture and their way of life, right? Their political power, their survival, didn't want to see this nation add states that were going to eventually outnumber slave states, you see? So if you have, right then at that particular moment, it was roughly equal, or even the South had more political power because their congressmen and senators, back in those days, the senators were directly appointed by the state legislatures, by the way. And, but it became clear that if we're adding states that are going to be going to California, we, the Southern states, have to lay down our marker now and make sure that free states don't outnumber slave states, right? So, or we're signing on to our own suicide. You see, it'll be our suicide. Now, from a culture standpoint, right? The United States literally has two completely different cultures. You see, the Southern economies were based on this agrarian, rural, tobacco, cotton, other kinds of major crops, etc. And so you had a lot of people who wound up getting rich, certainly even between the time of Monroe's presidency and the time of Lincoln's presidency, right? Because you had technological advancements like the cotton gin, you see? So that means that you could actually manufacture, like you could become incredibly profitable. And you also have the technology of, well, I don't know too much about this, but it's like some kind of a new loom where, on a mass factory scale, you could actually make sheets and I don't know, blankets and cloth for garments and things like that, right? So we had the North, right, even up certainly around here in New England, which were actually taking the raw materials that were being produced in the South. And we were actually had the technology now to actually manufacture a lot of finished goods. You see, so there was a lot of Northerners who politically were in bed with the Southerners because we wanted to make a profit too. So when we talk about the Civil War, it's not like the North was in this big moral position and everybody was an abolitionist. From a monetary standpoint, there was a tremendous incentive to, kind of turn a blind eye, so to speak, to slave labor. And from an interesting standpoint, going along some of the parallels that I've made between now and other times that we don't consider even having to do with us like this, I would say that you would see a similar kind of blind eye towards particularly China, right? Right? Anybody have one of these things? See? Or all kinds of stuff. And, so it's like, do I know where it comes from? Do I know who I made it? Do I want to know? No, I don't. I want to look at my emails and my text messages. See? So, there's a lot of similarities that, because of human nature, really remain exactly the same. You change the dates, you change the times, I mean, heaven knows what AI will do to us. That's a discussion for a different day. And, but so Missouri is going to be admitted to the Union, right? So it's kind of like Henry Clay considers himself to be somebody who's an excellent compromiser. So he creates something called that's known by history to be the Missouri Compromise. And so here's what we're going to do. At the same time, there's another territory that used to be part of Massachusetts that now wants to branch off into its own statehood and is applying for statehood, which we know now is the state of Maine. So, I mean, Maine wasn't applying to be a slave state. So the compromise is that, fine, we're going to make Missouri admitted to the Union and they can have slavery, right? So rack up one for a slave state. And Maine is going to be a free state, you see? So now if you look at a simple map of the territory of North America, where we know where the United States is now because we know where the United States is. But if you're looking at it and you don't know where it's going to be, right? But you're speculating about where it's going to be straight across to the Pacific, which of course it is, right? Washington, Oregon, California. You've got Southern politicians looking at what is going to be someday, probably because of the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, the whole country, right? or the lower 48, and which nobody knew was going to be 48. So the Southerners were saying, well, like, how do we make sure that there's always an equilibrium between slave-holding states and free states, you see? Or we have the majority of power, right? You don't never want to be in a position where you're going to have more free states, because then the free states are going to have more political power than the slave states, and essentially they're going to be able to legislate against the slave states, and that's something that can't allow to be happen. See, so it was a do or die thing. It was a do or die thing, right? We cannot allow the northern culture to eradicate the southern culture. I mean, that's what it was. It was, we will die if we can't have slavery. Not because you need somebody to pour your tea for you or shine your boots. You see, I mean, it was literally a way of life that had meaning to it. The southern colonies, well, the southern states, felt as though they were the highest evolution of Western civilization. They had taken what was from Europe, right? And we brought it over here without what Washington was saying we were trying to get rid of about Europe. And now we were able to have the highest expression of what Europe couldn't do, because they were all fighting all the time, you see. And now we were going to have these great plantations, and we were going to have essentially a caste system, the same way that came from Europe. I mean, the people in the South didn't invent that. It came from Europe, right? In the same way that my grandparents, even in the 20th century, they were part of the peasant class, and could never hope to essentially ascend out of that in Europe, right? But here in the United States, you could, right, if you were able to, have enough grit and determination and wherewithal, and maybe change your name, So, so the southern states were saying, like, they had a tremendous contempt for the North, because the northern states, right, in places like where we are now, and certainly in the burgeoning like area around the Great Lakes, like we were just talking about, where they had a lot of European immigrants coming from Germany, Scandinavia, right? And then, of course, you have these great waves of people coming from where, right? Ireland, Jewish people, Germans, right? People like, from not Scandinavia, but from the Slavic nations, right? And from people from like Ukraine, like my mother's parents, you see? Except this is all obviously before that. But same thing. See, the difference is that the people who were flooding the cities and who were populating the North were different than the people in the South. The slave labor in the South were African Americans, obviously. You see, the people in the North who came over were practically the same as indentured servants, and seen by many to be kind of like a form of Negro, right? If you want to talk about Irish Americans, right? Irish Americans were heavily prejudiced against, not only for their Catholicism, but like Irish Americans were like, these drunken fools who were good at nothing but getting into fights and drinking, but they were excellent laborers, right? And needed to be controlled by the majority population, you see? And one of the things that the South was looking at, they were looking at people and saying, well, the Northerners are hypocrites because they treat their slaves, like Irish Americans would be a good example, like slaves. They're prejudiced against, they're held in contempt, they're segregated, and by their religion and by their culture. And how does that make the Northerners, who were always spouting off about abolition, how does that make them any better than us? As a matter of fact, we're better to our slaves than they are to their slaves. See, that was the kind of thing that was going on. It was considered, the North was considered highly hypocritical and haughty and judgmental and moralizing. And to a lot of extent, they were. Not to say that slavery was right. Okay. Don't make that equivalency. I'm just pointing something out from the other angle. And so the Southern states, they saw it as they didn't want to be taken over by this industrialized society, like had infected the North, right? And in the 1800s, because of the rise of industrialization in the North, in the Union, as it was to become known during the Civil War, it changed the culture. And the culture was that as people were working in industrialized societies, right? Right, you had steam engines driving these long axles inside these factories. And these factories were turning people into kind of like extensions of machinery, you see? Now, this is about 20 years, 25 years after Monroe, but we're already moving into this ilk of the difference between the North and the South, right? So the North was essentially diminishing humanity because it had its people in these industrial centers doing labor in factories, okay, with the conditions as they were. And then you had the rise, like I said, 20 years later of people after Monroe don't forget Karl Marx, who had probably the greatest effect of philosophy and the way of looking at how you've taken people and turned them into machines. And it was really these people who didn't get any credit for anything and were being essentially exploited and used up, needed to rise up as the proletariat, as his term would be, against, of course, the oppressive bourgeoisie, you see? I mean, that is literally just one click after Monroe's time. You see, but as it goes to the discussion I was just having before, my point is that the South saw themselves as having a superior culture that wasn't infected by this industrialism, that wasn't infected by all of these European peasants, you see, etc. And they had to protect themselves, or else they would suffer a fate worse than death. Their beloved culture would be gone, and it was their responsibility to make sure it didn't go, right? And we look at it, of course, obviously differently now and say, well, how could you support slavery? I mean, you owned people, you can't do that. So it's just this cut and dry thing, but everything's too cut and dry now, so you can agree to not support slavery, yet, have an understanding of what both sides of an argument are. And sometimes I get in trouble with that because people stop me like well, you're not even allowed to acknowledge that because you're making them sound normal and they can't be made to sound normal, you see? Now, as a historian, I like to go back and look at things were at the time, right? And to be able to say, what was really going on here? I mean, we could look at our own time today and we could say, well, here's what people think because of this, and here's what people think because of this, right? And then to be able to look at something that happened in Monroe's day and apply the same kind of moral certitudes that we have of the year 2023, it's a complete distortion of history. You see, we have to be able to go back and see things as they were, and then we have less of a tolerance of being able to do that now, which is distressing to me. But so Missouri, the bottom of Missouri, the bottom of the state, right? I forgot what latitude that was, right? But in the Missouri Compromise, it was going to be understood that any territory that was going to be turned into a state, underneath that line, that demarcation point, only above it could be free states. You see, so even there, the South was setting down its marker, and in this compromise that was there. Now, this was going to go on fire after we had the Mexican-American War, because the Mexican-American War gave us all that territory. You see, and the land that was acquired after the Mexican-American War deliberately now fell along that demarcation line, you see, and the fight about what was going to be a slave state and a free state was on big time. You see, so here, right at this point, you can see how all of this sort of like overlaps each other, you know, and I've got to take it like a salad and take a platter and actually like, okay, and take the lettuce out, put the lettuce over here, and the tomatoes and put the tomatoes over here, and take the sliced onions and put the onions over here. And they each need to be examined together to understand how the whole is actually has a certain flavor. And it's quite a bit of information. I hope I've been able to be lucid about what I was trying to be lucid about. And I look forward to seeing you very much next time around, which will be our last time, right? And I'm going to talk about legacy. And here's my administrative assistant, who deserves all of the credit. She gets 10% straight off the top of everything.
Thank you so much again, Art. We did have one question in our chat today. They said they're hoping that you will give us your understanding of why we chose James Monroe as our town name.
Oh, he was a popular guy. Oh, I could do that in a second. The reporters, whatever they were, the journalists of the day, they called Monroe's presidency the era of good feelings. Okay, it was like politically, certainly in the beginning, it was a sweet spot between the opposite party, right? The old Federalists from New England had literally collapsed, you see, and Monroe was able to walk into a situation where there weren't political opponents of him beating him to death on a daily basis. You see what I mean? So it sounded nice and calm. It sounded nice and calm. It sounded like there was an era of peace, right? It was an era of peace because politically, particularly, imagine, for instance, if there was like, I don't know, there wasn't like the political vitriol that we have constantly today, with one side literally trying to destroy the other on a daily basis. That, for a brief moment of time, because of the collapse of the opposite party, left Monroe in a very enviable position where there weren't people trying to cut his head off every day, you see? And that's actually how he became president. So because, you know, it was just kind of like this moment of without vitriol, it was nicknamed like the era of good feelings, you know, and why not name a town after Monroe? I mean, you know, he was president for 2 terms, and you know, I mean, if during the time where Monroe, the town of Monroe was named the town of Monroe, if they had Google and they had Wikipedia, right? Maybe they wouldn't have named it Monroe. But it was a long time ago, and he seemed like a good guy, and he seemed like he was standing up for the principles of the United States of America. And he was the last of like the legacy of the Virginia dynasty, and there was no reason not to name it after him. You see, he was a very popular person for his time.
Well, thank you, Art. That was a great response. Thank you so much. All right, so everyone, so thank you so much for coming out today. Thank you, Art, for your time as always.
Thank you.
As Art says, our next session will be Wednesday, May 17th at 2 p.m. and it will be our last session. If you missed any of the previous sessions, they will be available on our YouTube page. I will make sure to link them in the emails when I send them out later this week. Thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you all very soon. Thanks again. Bye, Art.